Chapter 1, The Evolution of Psychology. Basic questions we're going to be looking at in this lecture. 1. What is psychology? 2. What are the major research areas in psychology? 3. What are the professional applied specialties in psychology? And 4. What were the first two major schools of thought in psychology? So what is psychology? This is a basic question. Most of you have some presupposition or beliefs about what psychology is coming into this class. The word itself, the etymology of the word, is the combination of the two Greek words psyche and logos, which essentially translates into the study of the soul. Psychology is a vast discipline. It's emerged over the last 100 or so years. It is both a science that studies behavior and the physiological and cognitive processes that underlie it, and it is also a profession that is used in the service of real-world problems. So psychology is both a science and a profession. 9 major research areas. You can read about these in your text. In the 9th edition, earlier editions, I believe, have 7 major research areas. So we have developmental psychology, social psychology, educational psychology, health psychology, physiological psychology, experimental, cognitive, psychometrics, and personality. I just want to grab a couple of these because you can read about them. Developmental psychology, the first one. Developmentalists are concerned with how we change and grow change and stay the same over the course of the lifespan. So the real riddle for the developmentalist is looking at the human person and understanding the nature of maturation. That is, there's some parts of us that remain fairly stable over the course of our lifespan. Our temperaments, for example, our personalities, some aspects of our personalities will remain pretty much the same, whereas other parts of us will change over the course of the lifespan. The second one, social psychology. The social psychologist is interested in how the real or imagined presence of others influences how we think, feel, and behave. So all of us have certain behaviors and thoughts and emotions that are linked to the presence of others, either the real or imagined presence of others. So the social psychologist is particularly fascinated with social situations and the power they hold over us. Sometimes the power of the situation can be so strong it can overwhelm our personalities or our dispositions and lead us to do things that we wouldn't believe ourselves to be able to do in a million years. I want to just jump to the bottom here. Psychometrics, for example, they're interested in tests and measurements. So psychology is a science, and as a science we're interested in looking at particular variables and so forth. Self-esteem, for example, is a variable that I suspect that many people are familiar with. It's essentially your attitude toward yourself. And so it's not something that can be directly observed. It's something that is a construct, so to speak, that is, we've got to figure out how to measure it because it's not something that can be weighed or put on a scale or cut out of your brain and examined and that sort of thing. It's something that we believe to exist and that's important because it's correlated with other important things, but we have to figure out a way to measure it. So psychometricians develop these tests and measures. IQ is another good example. Cognitive ability is something that we all have an understanding of, but how do you measure it? So psychometricians are interested in tests and measures. And then the last one, personality psychology. Those individuals are interested in dispositional traits and attributes that we possess, that we carry with us over time and across situations that influence how we think, feel, and behave. So in contrast, the social psychologist is interested primarily in the power of the situation, the social situation, whereas the personality psychologist would be primarily interested in those internal traits or dispositional attributes that characterize our behavior and our emotional life and our cognitions or our thoughts. So that's some examples of the major research areas. Certainly read about them in your text. I want to talk a little bit about psychology as a profession. So what is applied psychology? There's four major areas: counseling, clinical, school, and industrial, organizational. Occasionally we'll see sports psychology as an applied area. Certainly it's a large area within the field of psychology, but I'm not going to talk about it here. The first two, counseling and clinical, are typically what students come into an intro psychology class believing psychology is all about. All psychologists are counselors or clinicians, but that's actually not the case. Many are, but many are scientists that are doing research. So the counseling and clinical folks are interested in helping people in working through their real world problems. School psychologists work in educational settings with kids often. Sometimes they'll work in private practice as educational consultants, helping find a fit for a kid who maybe is struggling with some issues in the regular school system. And then the industrial organizational folks work out in industry. They're helping industry in boosting productivity, finding out those various motivational factors that will help people be more productive on the job or less productive, as the case may be. A whole host of human resources issues. How do you choose the right employee for the job, and that sort of thing. So there's people working out in industry as psychologists. Little concept check here, and I'll throw these in these lectures just to make sure everybody's on the same page here with respect to the things that we're talking about. So, which of the following areas is most likely to be classified as an applied area of specialization in psychology? So we've talked about psychology as a science and the 9 major research areas, and then we just talked about the applied areas. So which of these would be an applied area? A, psychometrics. B, social psychology. C, experimental psychology. D, counseling psychology. If you said D, that is correct. So here's a pie chart showing the breakdown of PhDs working out in the field of the applied areas and in other areas. So we see that those in private practice, the clinicians and the counselors, constitute 33.6%, it's around 34%, and then over here we have the colleges and universities, another 28%. So we can say and truly be correct statistically that most psychologists are working in private practice and colleges and universities. And then we have those working in hospitals and clinics, business and government, and then we have the school psychologists, and then the other category, sort of a catch-all. So that's kind of the breakdown of those with the PhD working out there in the world. I've included a link in the Tegrity Lectures folder to the American Psychological Association website. So once you're finished with this lecture, take a second and go to the APA website and browse around. The APA is the large professional organization that most psychologists belong to. So take a look. In particular, you might want to look at the divisions of the APA, and you'll see that there's, I think, over 50 now divisions of the APA. So these divisions reflect different people pursuing different areas of interest. Many of these divisions have their own annual conferences. They have their own publications. So really, it's a vast and varied discipline. So take a look at the website. So psychology today is vigorous and diversified. It wasn't always the case. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of psychology that leads up to where we're at today, which is a vast field with many, many different people doing different things. So a very brief history is what we're going to talk about now. So antiquity. This is back in the era before Christ. In the time of the great Greek philosophers, there was much speculation about human behavior, what underpins emotions, what underpins the way we think and behave. And much of the knowledge that was generated pertaining to these things came from speculation, observation, and reason. People thought about human behavior. And then with the advent of the scientific revolution and the rise of experimentation and science as the principal pathway to truth and understanding and knowledge about human behavior, largely replaced philosophy as the primary path to knowledge. And then in the late 1800s, the new experimental science of psychology emerged and displaced philosophy altogether as the premier pathway to knowledge about human behavior. So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit now, is the early thinking and the early thinkers in psychology. So this individual, Wilhelm Wundt, was considered, or is considered, the father of experimental psychology. Wundt was a German physiologist, as were a lot of the early psychologists. He's credited with establishing the first experimental psychology lab in Leipzig, Germany in 1879. So that's sort of the de facto birth date of psychology and the birthplace as well. So Leipzig, Germany, 1879. And Wilhelm Wundt is credited with establishing that laboratory. So Wundt's major contribution was to establish psychology as an independent discipline separated out from philosophy, and to establish it as an experimental scientific discipline largely modeled after the other natural sciences of the day: physics, biology, chemistry, and so forth. So Wundt defined psychology as a scientific study of consciousness. So one of the key tasks of a new science is to decide what the subject matter of the new science is. That is, what are we in the business of studying, as well as how are we going to study it. So early on, psychology was described or defined as the scientific study of consciousness. So what is consciousness? My hunch is that most of you have some idea about what consciousness is, but maybe have never actually defined it. So here's a definition. Think of consciousness as your awareness of internal and external stimuli. So external stimuli would be the sound of my voice, the visual sensations and perceptions that you're having watching this lecture. And then internally, you may be thinking your own thoughts and that sort of thing. So the awareness of these internal and external stimuli is considered consciousness. How to study consciousness? Well, it's not exactly possible to get inside of somebody's head and see what's happening in there. So Wundt advocated for the use of what was called introspection. And what Wundt would do is carefully train his research subjects in the procedure of introspection. And this was a systematic looking inward, which is essentially what introspection is. It's a looking inward and paying attention to what's going on in between your ears, so to speak, those internal experiences that you're having. And then Wundt trained his subjects to carefully describe whatever was happening in their consciousness to him, and then those narratives, so to speak, became the data of the investigator. So Wundt, early studies in sensation and perception, because he was a physiologist, he was interested in understanding how the auditory system worked, how the visual apparatus worked, the tactile senses worked, that is, the experience of pain, and so forth. So he would expose his participants to sensory stimulation, have them observe a visual stimulus, an auditory stimulus, or maybe a tactile stimulus, and then he would have them look inward and then explain their experience or describe their experience to him. One of Wundt's most talented and ambitious and motivated students was Edward Titchener. And Titchener went on to establish the first school of thought in psychology. This is the first perspective, which was structuralism. So he was a Brit. He studied under Wundt and he hatched this new initial discipline, this new initial perspective in psychology known as structuralism. To the structuralists like Titchener, the basic question of psychology is what is consciousness made of? So following in Wundt's footsteps, Titchener began to conduct scientific studies in sensation and perception using the methods of introspection with the view to having participants break down their conscious experience into its fundamental components. And if you think of a physicist as a scientist, as a psychologist as a scientist, the physicist tries to understand matter by breaking it down into its elemental particles. So Wundt and Titchener believed that this was the way to go about conducting the science of psychology. If our subject matter is consciousness, well, let's just break it down into its basic fundamental particles and see what's there. And by so doing, we're going to explain these basic conscious experiences that we have. In the United States, William James was busy at work at Harvard, establishing his own perspective, early perspective in psychology known as functionalism. James's thinking was strongly influenced by that of Charles Darwin, who published a very important book in 1859 known as The Origin of the Species. And in The Origin of the Species, Darwin laid out what became a very controversial but very influential theory of evolution. And essentially, Darwin's thinking was that species had evolved, become what they are, both their physical and behavioral traits, over time through the processes of natural selection. So essentially, whatever characterizes us and whatever characterizes non-human animals is there because it serves some adaptive function. It helped us get along in the world in a way that worked. That is, it helped us live long enough to reproduce and pass our genotype on to the next generation. So James's thinking about psychology was quite different from the structuralists. The basic question of the functionalists was, what is consciousness good for? That is, James and the functionalists weren't that interested in breaking consciousness down into its fundamental structural components, but rather, what is the purpose of memory? What is the function of imagination and motivation and a whole host of other conscious phenomena? So James's thinking was that, all right, it's important certainly to understand basic visual sensations and tactile and auditory sensations and perceptions and that sort of thing, but we really probably should go beyond that and understand these functions of consciousness that help us adapt and survive in the world. So functionalism led to investigations in a whole host of psychological phenomena: imagination, memory, feeling, judgment, mental testing, that is IQ and intelligence and that sort of thing, development, that is cognitive development. Why are we able to solve some kind of problems when we're 12 that we can't solve when we're 6, and also sex differences, male and female differences. So both structuralism and functionalism today no longer exist as they did initially as basic perspectives in the field. Structuralism no longer exists at all. The lasting legacy of functionalism that I want you guys to understand is that it led to the emergence of applied psychology and behaviorism. So we'll get to behaviorism and the other perspectives in psychology in the next lecture. The learning objectives for this lecture today are 1, define psychology; 2, describe the 9 major research areas in psychology; 3, define applied psychology and describe the 4 professional applied specialties in psychology; describe, compare, and contrast the basic ideas advanced by structuralism and functionalism; know the founders' names. And then we have the red font objective: explain how war fostered the emergence of psychology as a profession, that is, how war fostered the emergence of applied psychology. The red font objectives, I want to remind you, even though this is described in the syllabus and elsewhere, these are objectives that I won't be covering in lecture that you'll need to go to the text and read about. And you can expect to see quiz questions and exam questions on these red font objectives.